This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It's another of my great films pieces. It's about Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's 1970s masterpiece, and I've got two guys who are going to talk about it and why they think it is great. Apocalypse Now is the film by Francis Ford Coppola, and it's been many incarnations over its over 40-year history. I'll be talking about basically the main release version, but we'll talk about anything else in between as well, whether it's good, better than the original or whatnot. I have Jeff Meny and John David Ebert. Jeff is on the left. John is on the right. I'd like to give my guests a few minutes to just give a little bit of background about themselves and anything they want to say about the film or film in general. So let me start with you, Jeff. Who are you, and what do you have to say about this film to kick it off?
Well, thank you for having me, Dan. My name is Jeff Meny, and I'm a professor in the Department of English at Oklahoma State University. I am the director of the Screen Studies program. My background in this topic is that I wrote a book for the Contemporary Film Directors series that was put out by University of Illinois Press, and that was back. My book on Francis Ford Coppola was put out back in 2014. So I think there was a period of years where I thought very much about Coppola and his work and his, I guess, foundational influence in the new Hollywood cinema. But I did write about Apocalypse Now in that book. And I think, I guess my assessment of it, first of all, I would say that it's an interesting movie. As you say, it has different incarnations. I think the 1979 movie is sufficient, but it's been helpfully complemented by the two versions of it that were released in 2001 and one just a couple of years ago, Final Cut. But it marks, one of the last movies in this run that Francis Ford Coppola had in the 1970s, which I think is among the finest runs a filmmaker has had.
I actually thought of maybe wanting to do the conversation. In this series, what I want to do is do one film by each of great director. And so here I had The Godfather's, The Conversation, and this one. And I didn't go with the Godfather because, number one, contrary to many people, I'm not as big I don't think as much of the second Godfather as I do of the first. But those are, in effect, films for hire for him, whereas this was a personal project. And though I think The Conversation is very underrated, it's a great small little film, whereas this is a gargantuan, Homer Odyssean kind of tale. So that was my thought about that. John, if I could ask you a little bit about yourself and any initial thoughts on this film.
Sure. I'm John David Ebert. I'm a cultural critic. I'm the author of about 30 books or something like that that looks at, all my books look at culture from the point of view of theory and philosophy and comparative mythology and media studies, stuff like that. I'm a generalist. I did not go through the academic system. And I'm the author of Apocalypse Now, Scene by Scene. So there's that book, which is on Amazon for anyone interested in it. And Apocalypse Now is my all-time favorite film. Hands down, no question about it. Number one favorite. It's a movie that I can watch and rewatch over and over and over and over again and never get sick of it. There are not that many movies that are immune to rewatchings the way this film is, which is also why I appreciate the other two versions, although I'm less excited about the Final Cut version, which I think didn't improve anything. I like the additions that he added into the Redux version with the medevac sequence, which is missing from the Final Cut, which is a scene that, though it's choppy and you can tell it's fragmentary and there are missing scenes there, nonetheless, it's a great scene. I like it. I like the increase of entropy that it shows. As they move down the river, everything is just slowly collapsing as they leave civilization and go into the heart of darkness toward Kurtz's world. And so I like that scene, and I like the French plantation scene as well. He did retain that. It's a bit long and slow, but it makes an important point. It brings a feminine element back into the film that is generally missing, and both of those scenes bring a more female element back into the film that's almost completely missing, that I think is important. And it's just a fantastic film. And as you say, it brings back the epic. That and Star Wars, which came out with George Lucas a couple of years before that, and Lucas was Coppola's protege, and he was originally going to direct Apocalypse Now, and he passed on it to do Star Wars, which I think was the right decision. But both of those films bring back the ancient genre of the epic, and they're just huge, sprawling epics, and they're just fantastic. The wonderful thing about epics and the structure of Apocalypse Now is that you can take scenes out of them and put them back. You can rearrange them, and this is what oral storytellers used to do. Before Homer wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, they would go around singing these ancient epics, and they could do different versions and cut and paste and shift scenes around from the oral tradition. And Apocalypse Now sort of echoes that. It's like a very late electronic or electric, echo of that tradition of, sprawling masterpieces. Anyhow, it's just fantastic.
Well, before we get into talking about, let's say, the original version, let's just talk about some of these outer matters. Let's talk about, the last show that I did on a film was about Aguirre, The Wrath of God. And when I was talking about that, I specifically mentioned the masculine and the feminine because we have them initially coming down from the Andes, the rock. This is the masculine, and then we get to the water and the feminine. Now they're going down the river, whereas here we're going up the river. So there's a difference in that. But I do know that Coppola has said that he very much really liked Aguirre, and I was just wondering if either of you know any influences that the Herzog film had on this film, if any. Either one of you.
It certainly seems to have visual influences on Coppola. I think that's indisputable. And Coppola, we know, saw those films and was an admirer of Herzog. And Herzog did a film for American Zoetrope. I think it was Hammett. That he was involved with. He didn't direct it, I don't think, but he was involved with it. So they knew each other very well.
I think, that, first of all, I think that the New Hollywood, in particular, that sort of San Francisco enclave was co-articulated with the German New Cinema in a significant way. And I think that Wim Wenders was maybe more connected to Zoetrope. I mean, he was a regular there, and but I think that despite the fact, it is the case that he credits Aguirre, Wrath of God, as being some kind of influence for Apocalypse Now. But I tend to think of Fitzcarraldo, even though it comes later, in terms of the pairing of Hearts of Darkness, the Eleanor Coppola documentary of the making of Apocalypse Now, and then Burden of Dreams, the Les Blanc making of Fitzcarraldo. To me, they're like a perfect mirroring of each other, and the projects are very similar. And I think there is in Wenders, there's two things that I think Coppola shares aesthetically with I said Wenders, but I meant Herzog. With what Coppola shares aesthetically with Herzog is both of them are very much interested in opera and the legacy of opera. And I think that, there is that where that comes from is a sort of the aesthetic movements that are the late Romanticism, and that Wagner fills the role of for both directors, in fact, and then the turn into a kind of proto-modernism that you see in Wagner, where he's really pushing at the edges of the tonal system to the point that it might break down. That proto-modernism then flips, I think, into a kind of high modernism that you find in Apocalypse Now, in the figure of T.S. Eliot and Brando's recitation of the Hollow Men, and just kind of a general. You see the books that were source texts for T.S. Eliot composing The Wasteland, The Golden Bough, and From Ritual to Romance, I think it is. Yeah. So I think those things are very much shared. But, I do think there's something, it's true, visually and just the voyage into the jungle, which on that level is coming straight out of Aguirre Wrath of God.
Let me just talk about those variant cuts. John, you had mentioned the Redux cut, and I've seen that. And to me, the addition of the plantation scenes made it a little longer. It didn't really add anything to it, but it didn't really detract from it. I'm not familiar with the final cut of a few years ago. How does that differ from the Redux cut? And you said you didn't think it was as good as the Redux, I believe?
I don't think it doesn't differ much. I think it just differs in what they cut out, which was the medevac sequence. I can't think of anything else that's missing. There was one or two small things, but it just seemed pointless to do that.
Yeah,
I was fond of that scene.
It seems sometimes these director's cut, final cut, seems to be a way to sort of do that Mickey Mouse thing with the copyright, just to give it a few more years.
It was that, and then about the same time he recut Godfather Part 3.
Yeah.
Like he just not. And I think he was like, I'm on a roll. Let's see what I can do with Apocalypse Now. And it's like, no, leave it alone. It's fine the way it is.
Yeah. He did the same thing with Cotton Club too.
Yeah, yeah.
I think some of that is that, that I think that the creative energies for him in those years, in that period, burned so bright that he is at a stage in his life where he cares to revisit them.
Yeah, this is that period of high genius. He was like the great genius of the 70s. And then I'm not sure what happened, but he seemed to, once he entered into the 80s, he lost something. He lost that vision. There's Rumblefish, which is a nice little film that most people don't know about that I'm particularly fond of. But there's not much else going down the line there until Godfather Part 3, which is like, another flicker. It's like a fading ember of genius that once was. It's fading, but there's still some glow there to that film. I like it very much, but it's got an awkwardness to it that the first two do not have.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to return to the point of the relationship between those three different cuts, which, I mean, I think it's something more than just like idle recollection of that earlier movie or that earlier period. Though I do think that's there. I do think it was important to him that I mean, what John is saying about what the addition of the French plantation scene does, and the medevac scene and the Redux cut, they are very significant. I mean, I think there are people, and I also like what he said about the kind of modularity of it, the way like oral storytelling, you can reconfigure these episodes. That said, I think Walter Murch had a tricky time reconfiguring it into the Redux cut, because there were certain cues that did give it a chronological order, and you could lose those cues, and so it was hard to. I mean, they did, for example, Lawrence Fishburne's character Clean is killed in the scene right before they visit the French plantation, and so they give him a proper burial in that scene. And Walter Murch found that a fitting scene because it was meaningful for the whole crew, but I think specifically for Chief, the captain of the crew, that this young innocent be given a proper burial. Without that scene, you don't get it. But I think, and two, there is like the masculine feminine interrelation is out of balance in the 79 movie, and some balance is reintroduced, in particular the way that the Playboy bunnies are humanized in the medevac scene. But I also think something of the point of a war movie is that those principles are out of balance. So I don't find it essential that the French plantation scene be included or the medevac scene. I think that for me, the 79 movie plays as a unified movie very well. And I think what Walter Murch found was that it was actually hard to edit in some of those scenes and still get the kind of momentum and formal integrity. So that's why I've always thought the Redux is a very helpful supplement, and I'm very happy to have it. I think that the palimpsestic dimension it adds to Apocalypse Now as a project is really helpful for our historical understanding of it. I think the thing I would say is it is an epic. It's a form of epic storytelling, but in the original epic, there was a unity of nation and individual. It's like the heroic deeds of the individual realize a national project, and Apocalypse Now is precisely the inversion of that, where like the fact that the national project is coming undone in Vietnam leads to the disintegrated subjectivities of Kurtz and then Willard in turn. And so I think what it is, it's a post-colonial epic. I mean, like properly termed, it's and post-national, I mean, like the coming up against the limits of the nation state system means that the epic is not the emergence of an individual hero, but the undoing or the coming apart of an individual hero. And so I think the French plantation scene is like really crucial context for that, because you understand that, these French figures hanging on at this plantation, they seem like ghostly apparitions. And Willard presses them, like, how long are you going to stay here? And they're like, we're never leaving. And he said, aren't you going home to France? And he's like, this is home. We met our defeat in World War II at Dien Bien Phu. We met it, it's not going to happen again. Like, this is the last outpost. So I think that helps make sense of what some people have found a little bit unsettled by the ending sequence of Apocalypse Now, which is like how critical take on Vietnam is Apocalypse Now, and it's highly critical. It's just that the French plantation scene gives it the sort of geopolitical dimension that it doesn't maybe have in the 1979 version.
I would like to add a little bit from Lacan here and Deleuze. Deleuze has a book on masochism where he talks about how when you look back at the basic structure of masochism, it's totally different from sadism. Sadism, we call them S&M when we put them together, but sadism is the cruelty and the tyranny of the father, and the father doing terrible, punishing things, as in Sod. Whereas with von Sacher-Masoch's book, what you have is a contract that is made with the mother to drive out the order of the father. And he does make a contract with her. And so when I look at the insertion of the French plantation scene, it's not absolutely necessary that it's there, but I like that it's there because it illustrates there's a kind of subtle covenant with the mother that is made in that scene. Instead of a contract, they're smoking an opium pipe. So there's a kind of subtle covenant made there to drive out the order of the father. And how I think that plays out in the climax of the film with the killing of Kurtz is that when Willard says, they were going to make me a major for this, but I wasn't even in their fucking army anymore. He now is doing this deed out of his own free will. And this is what Kurtz has been trying to teach him all along. You're a puppet. You've been sent, you're a grocery clerk on an errand. You have no free will. And basically he's telling him, if you want to kill me, it needs to be out of your own moral certainty. And Coppola said, it's really good if you can sum up the theme of your film in one word. And he said that the one word for the Godfather films is succession. The one word for Apocalypse Now is morality. And I think he nails it, because when Willard does finally kill Kurtz, he realizes that Kurtz wants to go. He wants Willard to, he thinks Willard is the man for the job, but he wants him to see beyond the timid, lying morality of the army. And he does so. And I think he finally realizes that he needs to do this deed, and his days in the army are over from this point on. So he does, in a sense, drive out the order of the father. The army is the father, the paternal metaphor, as Lacan calls it. So It's not absolutely necessary to have the French plantation scene in there, but I like it for that reason.
It's interesting. Before we started this show, I just mentioned choosing between this, The Godfathers, and the Conversation as the film to do. And one of the reasons that The Conversation was in my mind, even though it's a small film, is oftentimes I think this film has been misread by critics in that Kurtz is nuts and Willard is a bad guy. And I think back to the end of The Conversation where, what's his name?
Gene Hackman?
Hackman, yeah. Hackman is ripping apart his apartment, and he's if not insane, he's forming into a kind of neurosis. But all of these guys, in a sense, are so good at what they do that they seem to feel like they've gone onto a higher plane. Certainly, Kurtz is that way. You wouldn't have the mania that grips Hackman at the end of The Conversation if he was not the best, and he's absolutely sure that someone is trying to not only tape him but top him. And I'm just wondering if either of you have a comment on that. That one of the critical misreadings, I think, is that these guys, both of these guys in Apocalypse Now, are losers. That they've lost it or whatnot. But I think in their mind, they have become that cliche of they have become heroes in their mind. Like you said, Willard wants to kill. He goes and he is taking command of his free will. I just wondered if either of you wanted to comment on that vis-a-vis the Hackman character too, perhaps, if you want. Jeff, do you have a?
Sure. Yeah. I do think part of what's I think the ending of Apocalypse Now is equivocal because when Willard says everybody wants me to kill this person, like
even the jungle wanted him dead.
Yeah. So there is a way in which it's like a default act in some respects. I do think it is like he's coming to terms with what it would mean to have something like free will. So what I think is interesting is that he says at some point, perhaps in that sequence, how many people have I killed? 6 people. No, this is much earlier in the movie. He says, I've killed 6 people, but this time it's an American, which shouldn't be meaningful to me, but it is. And I think, part of what he's saying is there's still a way in which his action is still authorized by a larger system. And what he starts to understand, and, it's really interesting, his relationship to Kurtz, because he has not come face to face with him. It's strictly a textual relationship. He goes through pictures and letters and everything and reads about his career and constructs a person whom he will later on say, like, is not identical with the person that he comes face to face with, right? He says, I thought I would know exactly what to do when I met Kurtz, but I didn't. And I think some of that is that it's a projection from Willard, what Kurtz is, that Willard still did need some kind of father figure. He still needed some framework for understanding any authority that he would arrogate to himself. And what he sees in Kurtz, I think, kind of incrementally, is that Kurtz was, as you say, he's the best at what he does in a similar way to Harry Cole being the absolute best in the field. Like, even in The Conversation, the Bernie Moran figure, it's like, for him, he's good, and people are starting to recognize his work, but the standard for him is Harry Cole. And I think that's what Willard is. He's somebody that has gone into the system and risen through it to the point that he is like transcended it or come out the other side, however you want to think of it. The system no longer authorizes Kurtz as a subject. And I think that Willard starts to understand that's where, if there is such a thing as free will, that's where it lies, on the other end of the system, or by transcending the system, which is why it's such a weird epic. There's the connection between the larger authorizing system, which could have been a nation or a people, and then the individual is just it's come it's been separated. It's been disarticulated. So I think there's something to that. Like, what happens when you are trained in a system to the point that you become so virtuosic that the system can no longer support what you do? So that's how I would understand that question. And with respect to Kurtz, and I don't think, he is beyond good and evil in some Nietzschean sense at the end. And the moral question is one he has to decide for himself, because the framework of the military is not a moral framework. And that's the realization that he's come to.
John, any comments?
Yep. No, that was excellent. I thoroughly enjoyed that, Jeff. Thank you very much. Very illuminating. I would like to bring up the mythological aspects of the film, if you don't mind. I like that the story is so incredibly archetypal that it goes. Jung called this the night sea journey, when a solar hero descends into the underworld, and it's a sun hero, descends into the other underworld and then is reborn after fighting a dragon or a monster, a night sea monster, and then is reborn. And the earliest version of that comes from Egypt, from the Valley of the Kings, with the tombs there, the books of the afterlife, not the Book of the Dead, but the books of the netherworld. And what it shows there is the sun god Re on a barge. At 6 p.m., he goes down into the underworld, because the Nile continues to flow underneath the earth. And he goes down through the underworld, and he comes to the throne of Osiris. And Osiris is the god of regeneration. All plants come up out of the earth because of the powers of Osiris. And so Osiris regenerates him. It's as though he's running out of energy, as consciousness does, and has to go to sleep. And then comes to Osiris, who regenerates him, and then now he is able to fight the Apophis serpent, the monstrous serpent that blocks the gateway to the eastern horizon. He's always successful at that, of course, every day, and then comes out. And I love the analogy with the idea of this journey to the heart of darkness, that this is a night sea journey, an underworld journey that Willard takes, where he goes along this underworld river that gets less and less civilized as he goes. And we have the feeling of going backwards in time, from civilization, the French plantation sequence, Dien Bien Phu, and then eventually to tribal man, aboriginal man, and eventually to Kurtz, who is sort of in the role of Osiris. In a certain sense, Kurtz regenerates him, gives him a new perspective, and then we get the rain that comes in the last shot, as it does in The Wasteland. What the Thunder Said is the final segment of The Wasteland, where the rain comes and it heals the wasteland. And in a certain sense, I think we have a sense of regeneration for Willard, that the wreck of a man that he started as in the opening scenes, where we see him there burning pictures of his divorced wife and the gun near the pillow. He's obviously been thinking about suicide, and he's a total wreck. And the military come in and they pick him up and they take him into, they give him a shower, which is a kind of symbolic baptism. He's regenerated, but now this baptism is into the military order. This is the order of the Father that he begins this journey on. But notice that near the end, we get another baptism when they get to the Kurtz's compound, and the Montagnards there take him and dunk him upside down and put his face in a puddle of muddy water. That's the second baptism now. He's moving out of the military, out of the paternal metaphor, out of the name of the Father, into the realm of Kurtz, which is an ancient realm that's connected with ritual, symbol, and myth, and the killing of the bull also, which is intercut with Kurtz. All that has to do with regeneration, death, and rebirth. And so I think that it is a moral victory for Willard as he comes out doing this act out of his own free will. But I love how Coppola has connected it to all these ancient mythological themes that just transform the film into, it's not just a war narrative, like, let's say, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket is. Great, another one of my favorite films. But it is just a war film. There's not really a mythological structure to it, the way that Coppola has carefully embedded mythological structures in Apocalypse Now, as his protege George Lucas was doing the same thing with Star Wars, being the inspiration from Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. So they were both, at the same time, these two great geniuses were both importing mythological ideas into the new Hollywood, and I think that transformed it, just transformed it completely, and elevated it. And then in the 80s, we get this explosion of special effects movies, which I grew up on, and I absolutely loved all of it. Spielberg's films. Spielberg just sort of instinctively knows myth. He doesn't have a scholarly mind. He doesn't really read books. He just picks it up because he's intuitive and instinctive. And so we get all these films in the 80s that have these mythological subsurface themes and structures. A lot of the directors are naive that they're doing it. But I think these films are landmarks. I think they opened a floodgate to bring mythological ideas into Hollywood and transformed it. For me, that is the apogee of Hollywood, from 1968 with 2001: A Space Odyssey, starting with Kubrick, and on down, tracing an arc through the 80s into the early 90s. And I think what killed cinema in the 90s was the importing of digital effects, digitization, CGI effects that first started appearing with Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. It looked neat and interesting at first, but then it got old fast. And we started going to these movies in the late 90s, and they just looked like two-dimensional cardboard surfaces. It really ruined the sense of depth that analog photography brings and the texture of the film. Celluloid has a texture to it that digitization does not. It looks airbrushed and empty, and I think it killed cinema. And now it's a boring mess. It's totally post-classic. So anyhow, that's my ramble.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things like soundtrack and stuff a little bit later, but I want to keep going on with some of the things that we have been talking about. And as both you, Jeff, and John were talking, it struck me the symbolism from two Tarkovsky films, and that's Solaris, where in the end, Willard basically gets what he wants, and then he's just sort of left with a what now? And it reminds me of the end that the astronauts in Solaris play when they finally give up the ghost and go down into the little island at the end in the ocean of Solaris there. And then the second one is Mira, where Mira is constantly going back and forth, and the protagonist is doing the Billy Pilgrim thing from Slaughterhouse-Five. And it seems to me that Willard has very much of that kind of character too, that Billy Pilgriming thing. He seems to never be where he is in the film. He's somewhere else, in his head, out of the and you get sort of these avatars of who could be different versions of him, such as Duvall with the napalm in the morning and stuff. And you could imagine that the Willard character could have been him. He could have been Kurtz. He could have been a number of these other spook types. So let me ask you, I would think, and it just came to me, is that this is the kind of war film that Tarkovsky would have made, I think, if he was going to make a war film. Let me just throw that out to you, Jeff. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought experiment. I mean, in some respects, I don't know, like maybe the closest. Well, Tarkovsky did have the "My Name Is Ivan," which was the early version of Tarkovsky before he really became. Yeah. I think it is. I was going to say before he became what he would become, which is this kind of the great lyricist of cinema, which I think there's a lot of that in Coppola and in Apocalypse Now. It's maybe as fully realized as it is anywhere else. The sense of the lyricism of, I don't know, subjective experience, however you want to put it. And I think one thing I would just say really supports that is Vittorio Storaro's cinematography is perfect for that. It's, Gordon Willis was a great cinematographer, and he did great work with Alan Pakula, but then he did, the Godfather movies. And there was a certain way in which, like, Gordon Willis, he was known as the Prince of Darkness because he shot in such shadow so often, but that there was like a public dimension to his cinematography, whereas Storaro, I think, is really like the cinematographer of subjectivity. Like, it's a very private kind of experience of the world that he's able to deliver, and that seems very Tarkovskian in that way. I've always thought of the movie just as being very lyrical and impressionistic. But, maybe one last remark on what kind of war film this is. I just remember anecdotally a friend saying, like, why did no one ever tell me that Apocalypse Now was this kind of movie? She finally saw it after many years of maybe not resisting it, but being indifferent to it because she thought it was just going to be another genre movie. And it's nothing like that. It's really hard to communicate how much this is not a standard war movie. And I think some of that is what, John has already worked out for us, which is that, like, it means to install this story and these episodes in some sort of mythological superstructure. I mean, I think that's why this is a modernist work, first of all, and that's why, I mean, besides the fact that there's a whole tradition that's constructed where T.S. Eliot cited Joseph Conrad at the beginning of The Hollow Men, I think that Coppola is citing Eliot because Eliot had an understanding of how art works, and in the tradition and the individual talent, he says, like, this is how the individual artist inserts him or herself into the tradition, into this kind of synchronic system, which is like the works of art all gathered together. And I think that's what, myth did that for both Eliot and for James Joyce. And I think it's very interesting the way in which Coppola is transcending the genre picture by calling on that sort of that modernist maneuver.
John, any comments on Tarkovsky or the poetic stuff?
Yeah, I like the comparison with Tarkovsky. I was mainly thinking of Andrei Rublev, the sort of rambling, epic, wandering structure to that film is similar to Apocalypse Now.
Well, the raid of the Tartars and the Ride of the Valkyries comes to mind.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an interesting comparison. What would Tarkovsky have done if he had made a war film? And it might have a similar kind of rambling structure that Apocalypse Now had. Rambling, but not exactly rambling, because it does have the mythic overlay that gives it a structure to it, but it's flexible and open in ways that tightly plotted narratives are not. The first tightly plotted narratives are the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles. These are, Homer is inheriting an oral tradition and committing it to writing, very possibly because there's a fear, as there often is when myths and tales are committed to writing, there's a fear that they're going to be forgotten or lost. So that's when cultures tend to shift to writing them down. And then with Aeschylus and Sophocles, we get the first plays that are conceived as written works. And they're very tightly plotted. You can't tamper with those plays. But I do find it interesting that when we get to Shakespeare, in a certain sense, his plays are not very tightly plotted, especially Hamlet. And this has been experimented with for centuries. That you can take, it's a 4-hour play. You can take huge chunks out of Hamlet, as let's say the Mel Gibson version did, and just stick with the personal plot by eliminating all the historical references, the armies and so forth. And you've still got Hamlet. It's still perfectly Hamlet. So you can put structures in and take them out. So it's a little bit like Shakespeare is inheriting a bit of the epic mentality in that sense. His version of Hamlet is an epic, whereas the Mel Gibson version is not. It's very tightly plotted and it moves very quickly from point A to Z. So it's interesting how directors and artists, have these influences from the oral tradition, the epic tradition, the dramatic tradition. And I love to see how cinema, when it was at its height, inherited these traditions and transformed them into celluloid spectacle. I saw all these films as a kid, a shopping mall rat, basically growing up in the malls. I didn't know anything about high culture or anything. I just grew up on comic books and Stephen King. And then watching these films, I didn't know I was getting this, I just saw them as these beautiful epics. And I love your point about Vittorio Storaro there, Jeff, that's like half the experience of the film is Storaro's photography. It's so aesthetically pleasing that even as an 11-year-old, when I went to see it, I was just completely blown away. I'd never heard of Vietnam. I knew nothing about any of that. It was just a transportation to another world that was incredibly interesting and beautiful. And I don't think anybody has ever filmed war in quite that aesthetically pleasing of a manner. There's a great sensitivity to light glittering on water, how it reflects. It's like every scene is a kind of a painting. in addition to all the literary references. So it's just a very rich, rich work of art.
Well, I was just thinking when you made that comparison, the two films that I think deal with fire on film the best are Mira, the burning house scene. There's a dreamy quality about the flames that I don't know how he achieved it. Maybe it was wetness due on the camera or something. And then also the dropping of the napalm throughout the forest here. There's something just very right about the way they're filmed. It goes beyond just what you can visually see. It seems to be almost like coming up from the bowels of the film. But since you mentioned earlier, I think it was John mentioned Lucas, and he was buddies with Coppola. I wanted to just step back a moment and talk about what we could call the filmmaker's journey, because for me, I've never been a big Lucas fan of the Star Wars stuff. I always wondered what if he had gone with THX 1138 and gone that route into more cerebral films, what would have happened? But then Star Wars became so big, and that basically seems to have killed off any creativity in Lucas. And in the same sense, John, you had mentioned about after this film, I mean, he basically shot his big load. And what other film that he's done since then even comes close to being the epic, the grand, the personal? Tucker, Dracula, and I don't even know what he's done in the last 10 or 12 years. So I'm just wondering if these two fellows peaked too early, or because they seem to have, one did achieve the artistic gargantuan stuff that Coppola did, and then the financial success of Lucas was unprecedented. Maybe Spielberg matched him, but let me start with you, John. If you wanted to comment on that first, those two.
I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I love it. The first three films are classic, and then the three prequels that he did that everybody complains about, I like quite a bit, although I recognize that they are in post-classic cinema mode with all the heavy digitization. Nevertheless, Lucas knows what he's doing. He knows how to orchestrate a scene. He knows how to create a battle scene that is constantly astonishing your eye with innovative images, like in the Return of the Sith with the general that has 4 arms and 4 lightsabers. That's fantastic. It's just one innovation after the next. Disney killed all of that. The Disney films are a wreck. They're an embarrassment to the tradition. They're full of political correctness and garbage, and there's no innovation. There's no fresh ideas. And so it made me appreciate when the first of the Disney Star Wars films came out, it made me appreciate the prequels even more, their visual innovativeness. And that's the thing about them is, and the original films as well, such as the scene in Empire Strikes Back when, they have the snow battle with the giant walkers, the big walking machines. No one had ever done that in film before. No one had ever seen anything like that before. It's just total innovation. And he's inheriting the epic tradition through the pop realm, whereas Coppola has inherited it through the highbrow literary realm. Nonetheless, the two are doing something that is very similar with their films. But you're absolutely right that they peaked early. Everything after Apocalypse Now is a downhill slide. Everything after the original Star Wars films is a downhill slide for Lucas. And it does seem to be, that Lucas is a kind of a one-hit wonder. There's the Indiana Jones films, but of course he hired Spielberg to direct those for him. And really, we only have Raiders of the Lost Ark is by far the best of them, and each one gets weaker and worse and more cringeworthy as they go along. So yeah, they did peak early. It seems like that's this is all we've got to give. But it's interesting that Lucas was the protege of Coppola, and they're even handling similar themes, fighting against empires in both of the films. So they sort of parallel each other, and it also broke their relationship. From that point on, I think Coppola was jealous of Lucas's success, and he dismissed the Star Wars films by saying that this is just twerp cinema is what he called it. He was clearly jealous, though, of the financial success of the Star Wars films. And so that pretty much ended their relationship. But it's interesting that they were both doing something similar at exactly the same time. So that's my riff on that.
Jeff, what's your take on those two fellows, and did they peak early, that kind of thing?
It's possible they peaked early. I think a lot of artists peak early. I think, one thing that indexes is how hard it is to put together a really great filmmaking career in in the Hollywood industry. I just think it's what Coppola was able to do in the 70s is really kind of miraculous. I think the person I would nominate as like another another person who had a similarly great career in the 70s is Robert Altman, and I just think it's miraculous that either of them were able to do what they were able to do. Even Kubrick, I never understood how Kubrick kept getting money. Altman got money right up until things sort of soured for him with Alan Ladd, and Popeye's probably the end of his run there, and then he sort of had this like rebirth with The Player and Shortcuts and things that he started to do much later after a sort of exile from Hollywood. I think it's very hard. I think that you might say though that they were Coppola and Lucas were doomed in opposite ways. That Coppola had something. He was going to build an alternative kingdom. That's Zoetrope was his effort to build an industry apart from Hollywood, and that was going to shield these film artists, George Lucas, Walter Murch, Carroll Ballard, John Milius, and so on, from the sort of profit motive of Hollywood filmmaking. And for him, for what Coppola believes, or at least this is what he professes, and it might be, I think, probably performative, is that his fall from grace happened when he accepted The Godfather. That was, as I think you put it early on, it's work for hire. They were looking for a director for this potboiler mafia story, and he needed money because the whole problem with Zoetrope is that they were given an advance from Warner Brothers, and on the whatever you want to call it, the performance of THX 1138, Warner Brothers yanked their commitment and expected, they called the advance a loan that Coppola would then have to repay. And so he was really in a bad position financially. And so he did the Godfather films. He did the Godfather film. There was no, trilogy in Warner's imagination at that point, Paramount's imagination at that point. But the fact that then by going into Hollywood filmmaking as a for-hire director with Godfather redounded to his power, which he originally hoped to consolidate with American Zoetrope. That's what let him do The Conversation, and then he did the second Godfather, but then he got to work on Apocalypse Now and One from the Heart, which I actually think is a underrated film. But I do think it's his flip into postmodernist filmmaking rather than modernist filmmaking, which I think Apocalypse Now is really the high modernist film from the 1970s. But at any rate, Coppola, I think, believes he doomed himself by making a deal with Hollywood. And that deal, he ended up putting up a lot of his money, his properties, against the production of Apocalypse Now, which against all odds really paid off for him, and he ends up, like in his career, becoming a very wealthy person thanks to the Inglenook vineyards. But he didn't, I think that's part of it, like just the struggle against the Hollywood system was what perhaps doomed him to peak early. I think Lucas, on the other hand, is a different story. Lucas thought of himself as an experimentally minded filmmaker when he was at USC, and he was making documentaries, and he was taking influence from people like Claude Jutra, and he really thought of himself as like being a very visual filmmaker who was going to like be kind of avant-garde in his editing techniques. And it's really editing that he was first able to get into when he did documentaries he did the Lyndon Johnson documentary about that about the Vietnam War. But once he was able to get a chance after THX 1138 to sort of resuscitate his career in feature filmmaking, which was American Graffiti, and that let him do the big space opera Western Walter Murch explains Lucas going from Apocalypse Now to Star Wars as being a way for him to not take on the Vietnam War, which he thought was too sensitive, but to instead submerge that story and its dynamics in the story of Star Wars, which you could sort of the politics of Vietnam could be displaced, as John says, in the story of Empire that is a galaxy far, far away. So I think, Lucas has always bemoaned the fact that he thinks that he was meant to be an experimental filmmaker. He was supposed to make small experimental filmmakers. He was really a visual thinker, and that his skills got sort of pressed into the service of a sort of Hollywood system. This is his just it's his apology for putting together, almost perfecting the blockbuster system of filmmaking. But that's how he explains his career, that it was a long detour that he took away from what he was supposed to do, which would be an experimental filmmaker. But nonetheless, I've heard people say, Lucas has continued to say this about himself. I was meant to make small personal films, experimental films. And people have said he has the money. He could bankroll any number of small experimental films had he wanted to go that direction. I just think they both have complexes of different kinds about what it meant to make a career in Hollywood.
Well, I wanted to talk about 4 films that I sort of lumped together that were about Vietnam over the course of a decade. 78 was The Deer Hunter, 79 Apocalypse Now, I think 86 was Platoon, and then 87 Full Metal Jacket. And John had touched upon Full Metal Jacket. And it seems to me that both Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now, while they didn't get necessarily scathing reviews, they were middling reviewed, whereas both The Deer Hunter and Platoon were raved about. And I think they might have both won Oscars. Did they both win the Oscar for Best Picture? And yet, to me, neither of those 2 films that won the Oscars really hold up in comparison to the Kubrick, Coppola films. And the Kubrick film especially is somewhere in between. I mean, Full Metal Jacket to me is sort of a dark comedy. It's not as obviously a satire as Dr. Strangelove, and it's certainly not as straightforward a film as Paths of Glory in terms of being a war film. But just throwing those 4 out there, do you agree with my assessment that the 2 films that didn't get the good reviews are the 2 best of those films, and that both Deer Hunter and Platoon don't hold up to the degree of those 2? Let me start with you, John. You seem ready to go.
Yeah, both The Deer Hunter and Platoon, they're good films. They're not bad movies at all, but they're one-dimensional.
Yeah.
There's just flat realism in both cases. Stone wanted to tell, and he undermined the success of Full Metal Jacket, which was taking forever to get made. It was over 3 years. And then along comes Platoon and steals the thunder. And both Kubrick and his brother-in-law felt that Platoon had upstaged them and spoiled a bit of the success of Full Metal Jacket. And in retrospect, it's clear that Full Metal Jacket is the much greater film. Apocalypse Now, we don't need to even mention. It's the titan of all these. But Full Metal Jacket is a very, very good film. And because it portrays the war, in a satirical mode. It's a black comedy, and it's very clean and slick. The way that it's made in the 2 halves that have been stitched together, it's very brilliantly plotted and thought through. And I love that film. That's another film that's immune for me to rewatching, so I can watch it over and over and over again. The cinematography, Kubrick's very precise angles. He has a geometrical mentality. Napoleon on the battlefield, and also Julius Caesar had this, which is the reason that he was able to defeat Pompey the Great at Pharsalia, is because he could think geometrically and align his troops. Even though Caesar's troops were outnumbered by Pompey's, he could align the troops in because he could see their geometries, and he could project them in geometrical fashions that outsmarted Pompey the Great, even though he had way more troops. And I think that Kubrick thinks geometrically. If you look at each of his films, they're very precise, angular, depth perspectival shots. He always wants to make sure that he gets a depth perspectival shot so that you see the top of the ceiling gradually disappearing into a vanishing point. So he's an artist's eye for the visuals. And everything is carefully thought out because Kubrick he's got some sort of OCD. And he overthinks every scene over and over and over and over and over again. So by the time it finally arrives, it's pretty clean stuff. So I think Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now have survived the test of time in ways that the Deer Hunter and Platoon have not, because they're one-dimensional films. So that's what I would offer on those four.
Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you. I think that the Platoon is a melodrama. And it played well because the melodrama always tugs at heartstrings, sets up a clear, like in the case of Platoon, good father, bad father, and he's torn between the two. I think, I haven't revisited Platoon, despite the fact that my son has asked if we can watch it sometime, since I was a kid. As a kid, I liked it a lot because melodrama plays well for young people. You love that sense of a neat moral order. And that's, of course, speaking of morality in substantively different terms than we did with Apocalypse Now. I think that Deer Hunter, people said Deer Hunter was racist when it came out, and people have said that to this day. I mean, and Robin Wood wrote a great essay about Deer Hunter that I'll crib from a little bit. He says, like, you can analyze Deer Hunter in terms of these different narrative blocks. The first one is the largest, and it deals with wherever they are in Pennsylvania, Scranton, or whatever it is. And the blocks keep diminishing and getting smaller and smaller. And, part of what he's saying is that it has something to do with traumatized experience, the way in which the thickness of detail that comes in those early, very naturalistic scenes is lost in the traumatic experience of Vietnam. But, one of the effects is that Vietnamese people are depicted as homogenous. There's no distinction being made between who the VC are and who the Allied villagers are. Like, it's just not even in Cimino's imagination. It doesn't seem to be able to bring that thickness of detail to the experience of Vietnam. And in that respect, I love the beginning of Deer Hunter. I think the wedding sequence is fantastic, even the hunting sequences as well. I think I'd be happy with that as a movie. Just lop off the whole Vietnam part of the movie, and you'd have a pretty good movie. Maybe not very shapely, because what would it be about but a slice of life? But he does that so well, and he does the Vietnam scenes so poorly. So I agree with the assessment, and I can only back up what John has said about Kubrick. I mean, the idea that he's a perfectionist, symmetrical, nearly OCD filmmaker is borne out very effectively in that sort of split structure in Full Metal Jacket.
So, Jeff, let me start with you. I was just looking over the soundtrack for the film, and aside from the Ride of the Valkyries, probably the song most associated with it is The Doors' The End. The beginning of the film opens with it, and then later on it also plays. But you also have the great scene, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, where Lawrence Fishburne is dancing on top of the boat, and then of course the Playboy bunnies. You have Susie Q, and then the chaos that ensues. It's a very judicious. It's not one that's necessarily pulling out the songs just to give you, oh, whoa, this is the 1960s. Each of the songs, whether they're classical or pop songs, seems to have been really, it's just so well placed. Let me just start with you, Jeff. What do you think of the soundtrack and the use of some of these songs that I mentioned, and any others I didn't?
I love the soundtrack, and I love the electronic score in particular. I think that it really, it's the first movie that comes to mind when I think of the use of electronic music. And I think, Paul Schrader later on worked with Giorgio Moroder for American Gigolo, and I think that later it really it's the forerunner to a different kind of soundtrack. But it is, as you say, a really heterogeneous soundtrack, which is to its strength. I think it's amazingly well integrated, and the difference between what in film studies we call diegetic and non-diegetic use of music. That's the Lawrence Fishburne part. He's listening to Satisfaction and rocking out on their patrol boat, and as well the Bill Graham concert with the Playboy Bunnies. They're actually hearing that music diegetically, but then the end is used to much different ends. And one thing I would say, just as an aside, and to have a point of reference, another Vietnam film that we didn't mention because it's not a war film is Coming Home, which came out just before, at the same time as Deer Hunter.
That was Jane Fonda and Voight, right?
Right.
Correct. Yeah. And it's not a great movie, despite the fact that it has great performances in it. And in some respects, it's a really great story. But the thing I've never liked about it is Hal Ashby overdoes the soundtrack. He tries to get every 60s song that he likes on that soundtrack, and it's so overstuffed that I think it actually interferes with what the movie is doing best, which is its drama. So the end. Maybe I'll just dwell on that for a second, because you talked about the photographing fire in that movie being one of the sort of canonical examples of fire photography. And that's sort of, ode to Storaro, who is really was the perfect match for Coppola at this point in his career. But it's also, the way that opening sequence, which is just a brilliant opening sequence, and just the best couple minutes of film that I can think of. It's really Walter Murch that puts that together and really does all the great stuff with the lap dissolves, and the way that there's the rhyming between the helicopter blades and then the fan blades in Willard's room, and then there's the Willard's face upside down on the bed, and then the face of the statue or the idol that again is used at the end of the movie. And it's all to the end, the end scores all this imagery in some moments in hyper explicatory ways. So when it says this is the end, when the lyrics finally come in, after it's just been I don't want to dwell on what Murch is doing over much, but the way he puts the first sound on the soundtrack in that sequence before when it's just black, before there's any image on the screen, is the sound of the helicopters, kind of Dopplering across the screen, because they're using this Dolby system, this stereo system that hasn't been used before. And Walter Murch is absolutely pushing the envelope in what you can do in sound design and the location of sound on screen. And he really is this sort of founding father for sound design. People today talk about him in that sequence in particular. But so he's got the helicopter sound coming in, and then the guitar from the end begins, and then the snare comes in from the end, and he plays the snare and the helicopter sound against each other for the kind of rhythm of the movie, which is both a diegetic sound and a non-diegetic sound that create this kind of rhythm. And then when Jim Morrison sings "This is the end," you see the jungle just ignite in that moment. So it really does hyper explicate the way that and I think it says, I forget what the lyrics are. There's a part where Willard opens his eyes as he's lying on the bed, and the lyrics line up with it in some way. So he's really playing almost it's like a small art project or a music video for him within this larger story. And I think when it is recapitulated at the end of the movie, at the end, it's really, I think, hard earned. I mean, it feels the way in a musical or an opera, the way you will revisit a motif later on, and it takes on different meaning.
Yeah, it really is, for me, a perfect example of what John Keats called negative capability, where two things that you never would have, the images of Vietnam and this personal going on inside of Willard versus the song lyrics. You would never have thought a song by a rock band that's talking about all of this Freudian stuff, and then putting it with these carnal images of carnage. It really just works well. Go ahead, John. You look like you're ready to go.
Just going to say, and also the innovation too that's cool about that is that starting a film with no titles whatsoever, no credits whatsoever.
Yeah.
I believe that's the first film to do that, and it works perfectly because you're just, and sometimes that stuff can get a little bit, let's get this out of the way and get to the story, and that's exactly what happens. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Walter Murch one day for lunch, and we had a hamburger, and then he was talking about, at that point, this was long before, this was when I was living in San Francisco between 2000 and 2005. And so we sat down and talked, and he was telling me this was about a year before Redux came out. So I think it was in 2000, because it came out in 2001. And he was telling me, oh, there's all these other scenes that we never put into the film. There's a scene where Lance is talking to the girls, and he realizes he's sitting on a couch where the pillows are made out of human skin. And I looked for that reference in the medevac sequence that he's obviously referring to, and it's not there. So I'm not sure what he was referring to, but he was telling me about all these scenes that they could have put in but didn't. And I don't think they had plans at that point to do that. But then I had the pleasure a year later of it coming out, and I went to go see the film at its premiere in San Francisco. And it was just, it was astonishing. It was three and a half hours. Because every time I watch Apocalypse Now, I always want more of that world, because it's like a different, it's like a surreal landscape. It's a different world. And yeah, so that was fun. And then we went back to his studio, Todd A.O. Studios, and I had the pleasure again of sitting down and watching him work. He was editing the sound for a very bad movie. I think it was a Richard Gere movie about the Arthurian world. It wasn't any good. It might have been about Tristan and Isolde. And he would just sit there, and I saw him work, and he'd be like, here comes another scene. We need more sweeteners in the background on this scene. And it was a shame to see him working on garbage, this great sound design and editor. It was quite a fall, like sort of parallel Coppola's fall as well. But no, everything Jeff said about the opening scene, which does act like the overture to an opera. It's got all the motifs tightly bound together that are going to be explicated and unfolded as the narrative unfolds in a very operatic style. So it's totally appropriate that he incorporates Ride of the Valkyries, from Wagner's great opera Die Walküre, which I also had the pleasure of seeing a performance of. And it's totally mind-blowing. It's so powerful, that music and the staging, fantastic. And I think that in a way, then, Coppola is sort of creating a hybrid out of the operatic genre and the epic. It has elements of both of those genres intertwined all the way down the line. So once again, pure genius.
Yeah, when you had mentioned, I think, Jeff, about Coming Home, it had been many years since I've seen that film, but I thought of how well, not only that does Coppola and his music guy do the soundtrack, but when they don't use it, they don't overuse it. And I was thinking Coming Home does overuse it, and what immediately came to mind is two films where you had The Big Chill, which overused stuff, and then The Return of the Secaucus 7 by Sayles, which didn't, because he didn't have the money. And the Sayles film, I think, is much better, but he had no choice in doing that. I think it's impressive when Coppola had all this money. He could have gotten, maybe not the Beatles, but he could have gotten a Led Zeppelin, or he could have gotten, any number of Creedence Clearwater Revival or something, to just in every scene have that. But he knew when not to do that, and I think that's something that's quite good. I did want to touch upon it, although I don't want to touch too much on it, because there are probably thousands of hours of talk about this on the Conrad novella, and of course the difference being, this the original novella is about King Leopold, and the Belgian Congo, and the main character there is named Marlowe. And I think Marlowe also appears in a couple of other. I think he's in Lord Jim. He's sort of a mercenary in the Conradian universe, whereas Willard isn't a mercenary. Although I guess you could say he's a black ops guy, and yet in the novella, Marlowe and Kurtz are leaving, and I think Kurtz dies on the boat. I forget how he gets killed. Maybe he's killed he's stabbed or something. I forget what. But let me just throw that out there. Is there anything that hasn't been said about Heart of Darkness in this film that we can just move on to the next thing? So I'll let John go ahead.
I do like the reference, and it's loosely based on Heart of Darkness in a very loose way. They don't even credit it in the end, which I still find a bit puzzling because they retain Kurtz's name, but not Marlowe's.
And the horror. I mean, the famous ending of the novel.
There's a lot. The basic structure, the basic plot is the same, even though it's full of all kinds of differences. The differences, I think, have to do with the differences of the media, of writing versus film. You can do different things with film. It's by nature a visual medium that you can't do with writing. But I do like the reference to the opening line of Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is sitting there and they're on the Thames and they're having, I don't know, tea or whatever at twilight. And he says, and this too has been one of the dark places of the earth. And he's referring to the fact that England in the time of the Roman Empire had a limit, the limes, the wall, that where beyond that line they wouldn't go because it was all barbarians. So this place too was once a barbarian wilderness. And then in a way that projects the plot of the novel going back into the realm of tribal man, where the moralities are different. The way these people are is very different from the way the morality of civilization is. And that's part of the point of that novel. And Coppola borrows that with the idea of going backwards in time to Aboriginal man and there are differing mentalities and differing moralities that he encounters as he goes along. And he says, if that's how Kilgore fought the war, I began to wonder what they had against Kurtz. If Kilgore fights the war in a totally different way, he imports hamburgers and beer. He tries to turn it into a pop spectacle. It's American pop, brash and loud. Whereas as he's reading the dossiers on Kurtz, Kurtz says, if we had troops who were committed and sort of lived in an ascetic way and were dedicated to the war, importing American pop isn't going to win this war. It's got to be done in an ascetic fashion, almost with a religious dedication with specially trained soldiers, and we could win this war. But we're not going to win it with this American pop morality style of turning it into a spectacle, war as circus, war as, spectacle. And so, anyhow, I don't know where I'm going. I'm just
with Kilgore, wave height is more important than body count.
Exactly.
That's the fact that the waves break in both directions.
That's all important to him.
Jeff, any comments on Conrad?
Well, maybe the comment I'll make, because I do think that the lineages of this movie are important. I think that it's important that he's pulling from late Romanticism, proto-modernism, in both, Wagner's opera and Conrad's novella, and James Joyce's sort of high modernist poetry. I think all that's really important, but I think this would not be the film that it is if it weren't that you could route Heart of Darkness through Orson Welles. The fact that Orson Welles had taken a crack at making Heart of Darkness, and that, it had been something he'd done in radio, and when RKO brought him to Hollywood, that was the first project that he tried to work up. And I think, the figure of Welles as part of this modernist lineage is really important to Coppola and his cohort. I think that generation venerated Welles out of all proportion. And I personally don't believe in auteur theory, and neither do I believe does Coppola. I think he believes that the vision that makes for great filmmaking is actually a collaborative one. He never tried to take all the credit for this work because Walter Murch factors so heavily into it. Vittorio Storaro or Gordon Willis does. Dean Tavoularis, who we haven't mentioned, is part of the reason that these worlds are as either surreal or realistic as they end up being. But I do think that in the 60s, auteur theory was the cudgel that a new generation used against the Hollywood system. And so Orson Welles was the figure of the auteur incarnate. I mean, he was, for all of them, the great auteur of Hollywood. And he had put so much on the line to make Citizen Kane. And that's really the ethos of Coppola's filmmaking, that he was willing to put this much on the line for art against industry. So I have nothing more to say about the Conrad novella because I think it's been said sufficiently, and it gives the sort of, the way people critique Conrad is the same way that some people, it's reproduced in some of the criticism of Apocalypse Now, which is to say, is this a critique of colonialism, or is this just an act of colonialism? Is Heart of Darkness a critique, or is it a colonialist novel as such? And I think people felt that way about what Coppola did. That the hubris of his production to take this film to the Philippines, to strike a deal with Ferdinand Marcos to use all these Huey helicopters because he couldn't strike the same deal with the Defense Department of the United States. Like there is, Coppola said, like, that's the point of the movie in some respects. It's like we were, when he spoke at Cannes Film Festival, he says, this is not about Vietnam. This is Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I do think that that the way in which Wells is like the sort of, I don't want to say Godfather figure, but he really is just this outsized influence for that generation. And I think it was even John Milius that says, like, well, if Orson Welles couldn't crack this nut, like, I'm gonna try. So when Milius read the script, it was thinking that he could do one better than Orson Welles.
Well, it was interesting. Kurtz is a sort of Harry Lime-like character, just to talk about his most famous film portrayal. But I wanted to ask two more things, and then we'll wrap up and get your final thoughts on the film. I want to talk about the other sort of big thing that's been over-talked about other than the Conrad influence, and that's Brando and his acting. Now, certainly I think Martin Sheen dominates the film. It's great reactive acting most of the time from Sheen. But I think a lot of critics are very here and there with Brando. And for the few minutes that he's in the film, though, I think he really nails the larger than life, bizarro nature of this Kurtz character. And quite frankly, I take this over his performance in The Godfather, even though you can't really compare them because he's the main figure in that one. But I like this iteration of the later Brando. It seems more in touch with who he was. And for all of his bitching about the film and all of his stuff, he seems to really throw himself into the few scenes he's in. What is your take, Jeff?
Well, it's funny because one of the big, I guess, undecided moment in the history of this filmmaking is when Marlon Brando read Conrad's novella. Like, if he did Coppola read it to him? Did he finally get persuaded to read it? Did he? There's Walter Murch's account is actually that when he was being told to read Heart of Darkness, all along he thought that they were just talking about the Milius script, which he detested. But I've heard different accounts of this history. Did he read it? Did he not? But the Walter Murch account is that he read it, and it totally changed his perspective on the project. That he became committed to the character of Kurtz in a way that he wasn't when he had just seen the screenplay, and that he had actually insisted that he not be called Colonel Kurtz. He was going to be Colonel Laley, I think it is, because he thought that all these colonels in the Vietnam War had these Southern names. And in fact, they shot that sequence with Harrison Ford and Willard getting his marching orders with Harrison Ford saying Colonel Laley instead of Kurtz, and then they went back. They dubbed a lot of the dialogue actually because the sound of the on scene on set was not very usable for a lot of the movie. So that's again Walter Murch's genius as a sound engineer. But at any rate, I think that all of it's to say, at a certain point, he connected with the project, and I think Brando does give a sort of, I don't know, just sui generis performance, and it's a very interesting movie because its greatness can be measured on so many different scales. I think technically it's a virtuosic work, and that's Walter Murch and Vittorio Storaro and so on, Dean Tavoularis. But, and allegorically, it's a great thing. It allegorizes something, as I said, of their relationship to Hollywood and so on. But, it's another great showcase for performance, and particularly like a certain style of performance that, the people trained in method, a lot of them that Coppola favored, and The Godfather, part of what is just immortal about that movie is the performances. And I think, he doesn't do the exact same thing as he did with The Godfather in Apocalypse Now. He somehow embeds a lot of different performance styles and pretty gonzo performance styles in what actually feels like a unitary work. Like somehow the texture of the film is able to absorb these performances so that they don't seem like they're all in different films, So for instance, you have, I think, Fred Forrest's performance as chef is fantastic. And he is the high strung, like oddly sensitive soldier that he's supposed to be. And if you compare that performance to the other stuff he did with Coppola, whether it's One from the Heart or The Conversation, it's really remarkable what he does in there. But then you've got Dennis Hopper doing this absolute gonzo performance as the Harlequin figure from the novella. And then, of course, I think you put it well about what Sheen is doing, the way he's anchoring this whole thing is through his reaction, through his stoicism quite often. And I'll just say as a digression, that's part of why, I'm not even sure how to feel about the Redux inclusion of him stealing Kilgore's surfboard because of the giddiness that he shows, which is sort of, it adds to his character, I guess, but it also is not entirely in keeping with the character of this Black Ops trained assassin who seems to be, he is rising above good and evil. And I think the fact that he is so implacable is part of that, the greatness of his performance. But so all of those kind of play, the different registers of performance are playing against each other throughout. And then you have Brando come in at the end, and it's a very tall order for him to fill because he's supposed to somehow live up to the legend that surrounds him, in the dossier and in Willard's imagination. And I think he does it. Against the odds, I think he does it. And something of it is, there's a story that he, after he gets through that sort of improvised monologue, he says, "Francis, that's all I've got. If you need anything more, get another actor." And I think, there's a way in which it was his swan song as one of the great actors in Hollywood history. The late Brando is weird and experimental. And even him doing Don Corleone is an important role because he just invents that character in a screen test for Coppola, puts some shoe polish in his hair, puts some cotton balls in his mouth, and he transforms, and he does it again. I think the fact that he was massively overweight when he arrived in the Philippines was a disappointment, I think, to Coppola, who was worried about how Brando was going to fit into the production. but you know, I mean, I think that it ends up working so well that he is this sort of hulking figure, um, and he is nonetheless got the poet's soul, and he does these monologues that that for the sort of Nietzschean self-understanding that he has arrived at, like those poetic moments of poetic discourse are right, I think, for that for us to believe that figure has sort of pushed his way outside the system.
John?
I agree with all that. It's excellent. And I like the idea of Swan Song because I do think that it is Brando's best performance. I don't think that anyone else could have played that role but him. It was made for him, and it makes the film. When you get there, you get one of the greatest actors of all time, and it's not a disappointment. There's nothing disappointing about it. He's utterly fascinating because you can tell this guy has gone over the edge. He looks insane in his eyes when he's talking, and his eyes are gazing out into the darkness. He looks insane. It's incredible. The performance it's eerie, it's brooding, it's dark. The weight is fine. They hide it mostly dressing him in black, but it just adds to this guy being a larger than life figure. He's physically large as well. I mean, so I don't think it detracts from the performance at all. And I like, the fact that, when he started out in films like Streetcar and On the Waterfront, especially The Wild One, or is it Wild Bunch or Wild
Ones?
Yeah. In that film, which is one of my favorite performances of his, he's so electric. I mean, he's like this ball of condensed electric energy in that film, almost like a bomb that's just waiting to go off. He's like, I'll tear this place apart when he's talking to the waitress at the bar. We can tear this place apart in a second if you want us to. And you believe him. I mean, he's 100% believable. And acting with that energy, it's totally convincing. So Brando, and post Brando is just, with Superman and on down, there's nothing there. So it's excellent that he, concluded his great career from Streetcar to Apocalypse Now, finishing off with his best performance. I do like the surfboard stealing, though. I do want to put this in because I remember in the original film, the only time you ever see Sheen smile is during Playboy Bunny sequence when he's looking at all the men who are aroused, by these hot women, and then they're going crazy, and it's Dionysus has been unleashed. Dionysus is the cult of the phallus, and they've got these phallic lipstick tubes on the stage. It's all about the genitals at this point. And he just smiles and laughs, because he's like stoically removed from this, as Jeff says. But I like the surfboard theft scene where because it puts a dimension to him that's mostly missing in the original. That's nice to see that this man is not totally emotionally dead. There is still a guy in there who once upon a time probably could have laughed very easily and had fun, but that's gone dark, that's dead. And so I think it adds a bit to his character. It rounds it off a little bit. Plus, the scene's very funny, too. I've seen Kilgore get so pissed off.
Well, I do think it's a defensible scene. I do think, there's a reason that it was included. And part of it is that he wants to one-up Kilgore. Like, Kilgore is he's the opposite of Kurtz, and Kurtz is more a figure that Willard is kind of like learning from, and Kilgore is just a figure that he wants to get rid of. I mean, if he could purge the military ranks of the Kilgores, things would be better.
Well, this guy is invincible, so let's steal his surfboard.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
I love it.
Before I ask you for final thoughts on why it was great and anything we might have missed, I do want to bring out one point about the ending, and I just want to give a little bit of a preamble because it's coming out of just listening to you guys talking like Tarkovsky did. So about a month or so ago, just as I'm doing my writing and other stuff here at home, I'll have YouTube on and videos come one after the other, and there's this YouTube channel called Folding Ideas, a guy who does some philosophical essays about this and that. And I think he does really good cultural essays. His art stuff I don't agree with, but he did have this one art video about an hour long, and I think he got it mostly wrong, but it was about Ralph Bakshi's 1978 version of Lord of the Rings. I don't know if either of you have seen that, but I was watching the rotoscoping of that, and then I watched the film again, and I I remember as a kid seeing it, and I never thought that any of the Jackson films were in a league with it. But here's where it gets to Apocalypse Now. After I rewatched it and I saw the ending with the Kurtz's head coming out of the darkness and all of those scenes, I was like, God damn, this is almost like live action rotoscoping. And I in my mind, a lot of those Bakshi scenes, it's almost like the ending of Apocalypse Now is very much, it has that feel of this Bakshi film. Now I don't know if either of you have seen this film, so I'm just throwing that out there. Jeff, have you seen that?
I haven't seen it, so I can't.
I've seen it. I grew up as a fan of Ralph Bakshi as a kid.
Yeah, I'm trying to interview him, but I couldn't get him. But anyway.
Yeah, he was one of my all-time favorite makers of adult animated cinema.
Yeah.
Fritz the Cat, I think when it came out, was X-rated actually.
Yeah.
And then he's got a lot of films that have a lot of racist themes. What now would be embarrassing to look at, such as Coonskin. Films like that, but then he sort of left the street world behind, starting with a sci-fi fantasy film called Wizards, which came out in the mid-70s, and then that was a success. And then he followed it with Lord of the Rings, which tells the first book and the first half of the Two Towers in there. Yeah. And Jackson does make references to it. There are several visual references in the Lord of the Rings to that film. So, I think that film failed at the box office, and it really hurt Bakshi's career. Yeah. And I think the problem with it, even though I admire some of the visuals and the rotoscoping, as you say, it's kind of slow moving. You get bored with it after a while. For some reason, it doesn't have the momentum that Peter Jackson's films have, that just keep moving you right along, and you can't wait to see the next scene. And I think that it starts, Bakshi's film starts strong, and then it's like they sort of didn't know what to do with it, and it sort of teeters off into, it's too long for an animated film, and it just bored the hell out of everyone. I appreciated it simply because I've been a Bakshi fan all along, and then he went on to do some more sci-fi fantasy animated films, and then retired basically. But no, he was great. I liked Bakshi quite a bit.
So let me just to start with you then, John. Any final thoughts on anything we may have missed here? Anything you want to add in? And then why would you recommend this to anyone who has not seen Apocalypse Now, as to why it's a great film? That anything that we haven't said yet?
Well, if you like film at all and you haven't seen it, you're missing out. I mean, you are completely missing out, because it's up there with films like Citizen Kane and The Godfather, Star Wars, films that are absolute milestones in the history of cinema that are essential watching. They're like cinematic peaks that appear, and we don't get those anymore. The millennial generation is totally out of touch with these kinds of films. They don't bother with them. They think they're boring and irrelevant. They're completely missing out. I had a millennial girlfriend at one point who had never seen Apocalypse Now, and every time I suggested, well, why don't we watch it? Nah, it'll be boring. And then later on, she did see it, and she was totally blown away. She's like, I can't believe how great that movie was. And I was like, I told you this all along. It's not Star Wars. It doesn't bounce from one scene to the next. It's meditative, brooding, introverted, and that's the whole point of the film. It's slow motion beauty, all the way through. So if you haven't seen it, you need to see it.
Well, I hope she saw it when she was with you, because it really would have stung if she was with another guy.
Another boyfriend.
Jeff,
jealous about it too.
Jeff, any final thoughts on the film that we have missed, and why should someone see it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the reason someone should see it is because I've mentioned the technical brilliance. I really think his collaborators were the best group of people he could have been working with. I mean, that's something of Coppola's genius, is to cultivate those relationships. And I think he was so charismatic that if he wanted to work with somebody, that he could persuade that person to work with him. He could sell his vision of things very, very compellingly. So there's that. He had great collaborators, and there's not many films that are just more beautiful in their construction than this film. I think the other reason I might suggest that people should see it is that there's a lot of filmmakers who have been really good filmmakers who you know, I look at their careers and think I wish they would have pushed it to the limit. They never made that huge film where they really tried everything and tried to bring everything together. I think, you know, that's partially the constraints of Hollywood. Nobody wants to back a project like that, this kind of go for broke project, but he did it. Coppola did, you know. I mean, he put everything on the line and made one of the most there's not much more that cinema can do. You know, it's really like it's the art in its highest order. You know, I mean, I think that's why we can talk about the soundtrack, the way it works. We can talk about the editing, the way it works, and the cinematography, everything else, and combined with the genre of the war film and the mythological dimension that he's drawing on. So yeah, I think that's it. It's like a great filmmaker going for the trying to climb the mountain, and he did it.
Well, I want to thank both of you for a really great conversation. I'll link to Jeff's university page. John, I'll link to your YouTube channel. And again, thank you very much, because this was an outstanding conversation.
Real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dan.
And Jeff as well. A very delightful conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much.
Okay.
Yeah.